So we're now moving out of a bit of a lull and in the possibility of games. We're now a month where there's a possibility of games or a plan in place of games, and that means preparing for one of the sports fans' favorite time of year, and that is college football. But for West Virginia University, they had less of a lull than others because of some recent news that I also touched on throughout the channel. But still trying to prepare for what right now is the plan for college football season. I'm your host here, Mike Asti, on this edition of Mic Drop here on Pittsburgh Sports Live, and I'm going to be talking with Brad Howe, who is a friend and colleague of mine. He is the former WVU Assistant Athletic Director and current co-host of the City's Net Statewide Sportsline on 32 stations across West Virginia. You can listen online at WVMetroNews.com. So the Metro News Sportsline co-host Brad Howe to kind of talk everything going on with the West Virginia Mountaineers. And there's a lot that's been going on and a lot that maybe still will go on. So Brad, thanks for joining me, man. It's been long overdue. I know that we did some work there in Boston on my last venture. I do a lot with Dave Weekly there with Metro News, but I'm glad we were able to connect for this.
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to talk with you, and it's good to talk some Mountaineer football. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, I always love talking Mountaineer football, and I also always love, I'm sure you do secretly too, getting some Mountaineer football conversation on a Pittsburgh outlet. That's nice. I mean, we're in the same media market a little bit, so we lend some coverage. It's not necessarily the flagship here for the outlet, but we definitely sprinkle in some Mountaineer news, some Mountaineer content, and makes sense to talk to you about what's going on. So I'm going to start things off on some positive notes, and we're gonna get into this conversation and what maybe will happen and your thoughts on if we're going to have a season and kind of the mess the Mountaineers just got into. But to start things off, recruiting. It was always going to be an important recruiting season for Neal Brown. I mean, everything else is going on just makes it more difficult, but this was always going to be a very important recruiting season. Last year, fans could kind of temper their expectations. I called for that. This year now, maybe less so. They want some semblance of a turnaround, but also want to know the future's bright. And it definitely appears like Neal Brown is a guy that wants to be the head coach of the Mountaineers for the long term, which is good. He kind of fits in. I've been buying what he's selling, but are you buying what you've seen in terms of recruiting actual product that are going to be on the field? What do you make of Mountaineer recruiting this offseason, a very important one for Neal Brown's regime?
Yeah, well said, Mike. This is a very important offseason because last year was really year zero. We referred to it as both in recruiting and on the field. Neal Brown got here so late, early January. So basically trying to not put a class together, but keep a class together, which he was able to do last year from a West Virginia perspective. So going into this year was a big challenge for him. Here's what I've learned about Neal Brown, and here's why I think ultimately he'll not only be successful in the recruiting world, but also on the field at WVU. He's about as organized a coach as I've been around. And real quick, just to give your listeners some of my background, I was in athletic administration at the University of Connecticut, the University of Maryland, and then, as you mentioned, at WVU for 15 years. So nearly 20 years combined in college athletics around some Hall of Fame guys like Jim Calhoun, Gary Williams, Bob Huggins, of course, Rich Rodriguez here at West Virginia. So I've seen a bunch of different coaches. Neal Brown, to me, the couple of things that he has said right from the beginning and people have said about him that I've found to be absolutely true. One is, I heard he's about as organized as you can possibly get. Now, do you hear that about other coaches at that level? Absolutely you do. But he is super organized, not only in a week of a prep leading up into a game, but the recruiting side of things. And that's what's impressed me the most. The system that is in place that those guys use over at the football complex in terms of recruiting guys is tremendous. And that's half the battle, Mike, as you well know. Yeah. It's not so much just about out there. When you're West Virginia, you're not going to have your pick of the cream of the crop. You've got to get out there, uncover some stones, find some guys, and stay after guys. And here's the second part of Neal Brown. Organization one. So know what you're doing, know what your coaches are out there doing, and have a system to track that. They're very good at that. Number two, Neal Brown has preached relationships since the day he walked on campus here. Relationships with fans, with his coaches, with his current players, and most importantly, with recruits. And he said this, he's not going to blow it out of the water in year one. But start to look in year 3 and year 4 when he's had a chance to really mine those relationships, and you're going to see the real beauty of Neal Brown. I think you're starting to see that for West Virginia. This class on paper looks pretty good. You're getting some 4-stars in there that West Virginia doesn't always grab. So he's been able to have that. And when you talk to some of these guys that have verbally committed, we have a bunch of them on our show each night during the week when we talk to them. And the number one thing they say, well, Coach Brown was on me or the assistant was on. They've been talking to me for 3 years. I met them when I was in 9th grade. So it's the relationship part of it. So I think I tend to feel with Neal Brown, the longer he's able to stay at West Virginia, the longer those relationships get to work with recruits, I think the better WVU is going to get. You may not see it on the field this year if we play football, but I think that's inevitable with Neal Brown and the way he's doing things.
And it appears that he wants to be there over the long term, and he is planning on being there over the long term. And he's saying and doing all the right things, and had that impassioned speech at the end of last season, basically guaranteeing he's going to turn them into a contender in the not-too-distant future. Do you believe, though, that the program sees him as a long-term guy? Will he be provided the rope in order to truly have these fruits of this labor come to fruition? Because that's an issue in college sports, especially in college football. Nobody really gets to lose for 3 or 4 years and then gets to turn it around, which is almost maybe what Neal Brown is asking for.
Yeah, so that's the big question, right? And I think that's why last year, that year 0 was applicable. I don't know that there were any expectations whatsoever from the majority of the fan base and certainly the WVU administration. They knew he was walking into
there shouldn't have been, at least.
Well, he had to rebuild. I mean, think of what you lost from that team.
Yeah.
Will Greer, David Sills, Gary Jennings. The losses were incredible on the offensive side of the ball in particular. So last year, quite frankly, Mike, the fact that that group was able to get to 5 wins and have the season-ending win against TCU, just short of a bowl game, I think that was a great way to end for WVU because there were times during the season when they looked awful. I wasn't sure if they were going to be able to win another game after that Missouri game when the offensive line got manhandled. So given how they closed and were able to show some improvement while still having a ton of deficiencies, I thought gave a good look ahead to the future. Now, we know what this business is all about. Make no mistake, it certainly is a business. So to say that he's going to get 2 or 3 years of losing football and not making a bowl, that's probably a stretch. And we can talk about expectations for this season here in a minute. I think he's got to win, but I don't know that this has to be a Big 12 championship contending team this year. I think this is a stair-step process. Last year, you get to 5, show some improvement, steal one on the road against TCU late. This year, if there's games, if this West Virginia team finds its way into a bowl game, can find a way to get to 7 wins, I think you're now on track to what most people, most reasonable fans, and certainly the administration wants to see out of this guy. Because remember this, Mike, anymore in college football, it's not like you get guys for 10 years. You might not even get guys for 8 years. So I think anymore, you look at that 5-year window, and if you can get it going and you've got 5 years, anything past that is basically a bonus in my mind. I hope for West Virginia's sake, Neal Brown stays for 15 years, but that just doesn't happen anymore like it used to.
Yeah, and if he ends up staying for that long, that very likely means it's a Don Nalen run where they're probably a contender for conference championships and beyond. Yeah. But in reality sense, West Virginia also has to keep note of who they are as a program. It's a quality program with a rich history, but it's not the elite of the elite. It's not going to be Oklahoma or Ohio State or those level programs. So if you start bouncing a guy that fits so well into your program after only a couple of years and you do that consistently, that could be a negative stain on other guys like Neal Brown wanting to come to West Virginia to coach, realizing there's not that long of a rope. So it's kind of that fine wire for the administration to walk in terms of you got to give him time, but you also can't let the program get out of hand.
Yeah, I agree with you. And listen, I sense from this administration led by Shane Lyons, they're all in on Neal Brown. Keep in mind, Shane Lyons hired Neal Brown. So we know in college athletics, when you're the athletic director that hires the football or the basketball coach, there's in essence a longer rope than you would normally expect. Listen, I may be dead wrong on this. I don't think I am. I don't even think that comes into the fact. I don't think it factors in that West Virginia is going to lose and you've got to make a decision about getting rid of Neal Brown. I think it's simply the other way is going to be more of the question, that West Virginia is going to win and you got to worry about how can you keep Neal Brown and make sure he stays long-term. If I was picking one of those, if you put those scenarios at either end of the spectrum, I'm way on the side of you will worry more about keeping him long-term than you will having to get rid of him in the next 5 years. I think it was a home run hire, Mike. I think it was a perfect fit. I don't know that we talk enough about fit when it comes to coaches. He fits this area. He fits this fan base. I think he's been a tremendous fit, even though the wins didn't come in year one.
Yeah, and I think year one calling it year zero makes tons of sense and is reasonable. And I think I almost got the sense of this right when he got hired. And I hate to get sold off a press conference, but he really did sell me in terms of how he fit in, his age, where he had success in terms of now being a stepping stone. It's a logical next progression. It's not like it doesn't make any sense job-wise. Just a respectful guy, knowing the history, I could see him being able to recruit the right talent as well as win on the field. And he just seemingly wants to be there. But that is the other thing, that it's weird to say in college football, the ideal Neal Brown year next year probably would be a bowl game, but you almost maybe secretly don't want to root for it to be too much more, because if they make a Big 12 championship run next year, the year after that, then other schools are going to call and you're going to lose him. That's if he gets too successful too quickly in this tenure after what he left, that then would be a concern that he then will get a stepping stone job above the Mountaineers, and there certainly are those type of jobs. Now, Brad, and speaking with Brad Howe here, the former assistant athletic director for WVU and also current co-host on the West Virginia MetroNews Sportsline show. Been on there a few times myself, but he is the co-host with Tony Creedy and company. Now, Brad, we talked about what needs to happen on the field and talked about Neal Brown being there and being a fit. In terms of position-wise, what are the battles that Mountaineer fans should keep an eye on? Quarterback obviously is one of them, but what else extends itself to be a position battle that needs decided for this program to get back into winning consistently?
And see, that's where I think you start to look at this program. And you said it, quarterback is, you know what, normally it's number one, and I love to spend time talking about quarterback, and you've got two in West Virginia coming back in Jarret Doege and Austin Kendall, the Oklahoma transfer. Both played significant minutes or games last year. Austin Kendall starting while Jarret Doege sat out, and then Jarret Doege taking over late to preserve the redshirt season, and he had some success there at the end of the season. So you always start with quarterback because you've got to find a guy that can win you games at that position. West Virginia's had a ton of great ones over the years, so you need to find that position. I think that'll be a good battle. Jarret Doege looked to me to have a step up when the season ended, but Neal Brown's been very careful to say those guys are neck and neck. They're going to battle. You're going to have two quarterbacks. He's not going to name a starter until we get late into fall practice, and I totally understand that. But that's the position to watch, number one.
Yeah, Austin Kendall had the hype, but he didn't impress enough to have that job given to him.
And he did some things, but I'm going to get to why I think Austin Kendall had some struggles here in this next thing that I'm about to say, because as important as quarterback is, and as important as those receivers are going to be, they're going to grow up from year one into year two. Here's the bottom line. West Virginia absolutely has to get better, and I mean significantly better up front along the offensive line. That offensive line last year for WVU struggled as much as I've seen any offensive line in recent history at WVU. I mean, it couldn't block the run, couldn't block the pass. It was doing it with young guys. It was moving guys in and out of positions. It had one of its guys move over from the defensive line and was starting a few games later on the offensive line. That's just not a recipe for success at this level in this league in the Big 12. So coming into this season, and a unit that struggled mightily last year in West Virginia's offensive line lost its best player in Colton McKivitz, who just went to the San Francisco 49ers. So I think, to me, we can talk about other positions if you want, but quite frankly, this team totally hinges on what happens on that offensive line. And, Mike, it's going to be really young again. So it's hard. You can see it maybe being better. For it to take two steps forward, I think that's the big question. And if West Virginia struggles this year, I have a feeling it's going to be because of the offensive line.
Yeah, and the problem is you don't have Will Grier, where it's a quarterback who's at an elite level skill set that he can make up for issues with the offensive line or other segments of the football team, make others better. You're going to, either way, you're going to have a quarterback who is getting the keys for the first time, really, despite some playing time last year. This will be the first true season where there are expectations, and we'll have won the job against somebody else. And you're going to have not nearly the talent that Will Grier had around him. Plus, as a quarterback with less expectation, maybe less natural talent, this quarterback's gonna need help rather than trying to help others, and that could be a concern. That yes, the offensive line can absolutely torpedo any quarterback. A Hall of Fame quarterback can't get it done with the poorest offensive line. So if the offensive line struggles, that will be a major issue that will certainly impact the quarterback, and then that could be a recipe for disaster where the season could parallel last year.
It can. And the challenge is, as I assume most of your listeners know, you can go out late and find a quarterback sometimes. You can find receivers. You can get a running back in there. But offensive linemen, it is really hard to go get a guy that's in the program for the first year, even if it's a JUCO transfer,
right,
even if it's a grad transfer. It's hard to get those guys, put them in right away, and be elite. So much like we say Neal Brown's trying to stair-step this thing as a program, that's what I think this line has to do. Just hold the fort a little bit. Don't be dead last in yards per rush like West Virginia was last year. Just get to 120th, get to 115th, be a little bit better, give a little pass protection. And that's one thing I've been impressed with Neal Brown. He's not a system guy as an offensive head coach. He's a, what do I need to do to find a way to win games? And if you have to lean on your defense, they'll do that. They did that last year at times. So offensive line getting better, who's going to step up and improve? And then the quarterback position with Kendall and Daggy, how much of a leap forward can those guys take? Because you were asking a lot of them last year. Again, two guys in the program for the first time, with a line that's really struggling to find its way, with a young group of receivers. I mean, there weren't a lot of things to hang your hat on offensively last year for West Virginia. So you're counting on all those games of experience pushing these guys forward enough that you can have a little more success, and then the defense has just got to step up.
Yeah, to say the least, and that's going to be a segue for us here. Talking Mountaineer football, West Virginia Mountaineer football with Brad Howe, former assistant athletic director at WVU and also co-host of the West Virginia MetroNews Statewide Sportsline with Tony Caridi, who I'm sure everyone knows, but certainly Mountaineers fans will know as the voice of the Mountaineers. And we'll see how many great days it'll be to be a Mountaineer wherever you may be this coming up season. But a lot of that does hinge on the quarterback, the offensive line, which then hinges on the running back. But all of that really is the offensive line. I think you painted a perfect picture there. The other end of things, though, also connects to some recent drama around the Mountaineers, and that is going to be question marks around the defense. The defense also needs to improve from last season. They did have to pick the slack up for a struggling offense at times last year, but the season was never going to go anywhere, and that was evident because the defense was also struggling. Their numbers, their stats, they weren't good either. And the defense, unlike the offense, is now going to come into next season with chemistry concerns and question marks because of the scandal they're coming out of with a player accusing the defensive coordinator of racially charged comments and being involved in a scandal in which the term racism is being used by somebody in a position of leadership after everything that just happened in the world. Horrible situation all the way around. There's really no winners here. But number one, how much will that affect the team moving forward? Because there's been apologies, there's been retractions, there's been conversations between coach and media and coach and players and administration. Shane Lyons, you mentioned, really has Neal Brown's back. I think that's been very evident through this, that he basically the whole time said, whatever Neal Brown says is what we're doing. He is almost allowing Neal Brown to be the leader of this ahead of even the athletic director, which isn't always the case in scandal. But how much will that affect this coming up season? And then the other question I have for you, how do you feel Neal Brown has handled this situation? Because he didn't ask for this. And I actually made a comment to our colleague Dave Weekly on his show, on the Hotline show, when I occasionally appear there, that scandal was Neal Brown's first big game. He didn't have any in year zero. None of those games mattered. They knew they weren't going to be a contender. He was trying to build something. That was his first big moment and first big game where the team needed to come out of that in some semblance of victory, and it was pressure to do so. Do you feel he got that win in terms of how he handled things, and how will it affect this team moving forward? Because when you have tons of question marks and you're struggling and then you have a chemistry issue, that could be a problem. It was not really the best of timing for the Mountaineer program to have a scandal with such an important year for Neal Brown and company.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, right? In that question there's a ton that we could go through on that. So let's pick this apart in a couple ways. First and foremost, the defense last year, there's some stats defensively that you looked at and went, oh, as you said, those aren't good. But if you watched every play of that defensive season last year, there were some real bright spots. And that defense did a fantastic job in some of those games. Iowa State, Oklahoma State, getting the win at TCU was because of that defense. There were some near misses that were losses that very easily could have been wins. I just mentioned a couple of those. Holding Chuba Hubbard, the nation's leading rusher. You talk about some drama on the off field. Chuba Hubbard, Mike Gundy, and Oklahoma State went through that. They held him under 100 yards for most of that game until he ticked up right at the end, and no one had been able to do that all year. So I was really optimistic about this defensive unit coming back from an on-field perspective. Darius and Dante Stills leading the way, two guys from just down the road, Fairmont, West Virginia, big fan favorites having immediate impact and having great seasons last year. Vic Koenning, to me, the defensive coordinator we're referring to, did as good a job with a super young unit and injuries last year as anybody I've seen in a really long time from a defensive standpoint. Excellent X's and O's, tremendous job of coaching. I think there was a lot of optimism around that defensive unit coming into this year. You mentioned the stuff that has come up over the last 3 weeks, and it's unfortunate in a lot of levels, and people can go back and read some of the things that Vic is alleged to have said that he did not deny. And quite frankly, they just weren't things you need to be saying in a football locker room around 18 to 22-year-olds. Right. I can see why Kerry Martin from Charleston, West Virginia, is the player that brought this to light and caused this investigation to happen from a West Virginia perspective. So as we sit here and are talking tonight, the results of the investigation are not public yet. Quite frankly, I'm surprised, given Neal Brown said this would be a fast investigation and a quick decision. I'm surprised we haven't seen that yet. I would expect that any day now. So here's the question, Mike, to your chemistry issue, more to the point of your original question. What ultimately happens with Vic Koenning? What happens with his position? Is he back? Is he not back? So you have to start with that for what that means for chemistry. But even before you get to that question, what has happened throughout this investigation? Because to me, this was about what the players thought of this situation. Is this 15, 20, 25, 30 guys that came forward and said, hey, listen, this is a problem. We can no longer play for Vic Koenning. If that's the case, well, that tells you one thing. He probably doesn't retain his job. If this were a bunch of guys, and per Kerry Martin's tweets, he wasn't interested at the time in Vic Koenning losing his job. He just wanted to bring some of these to light. So is that the prevailing thought in the locker room? Again, this isn't just about one player and one coach. What was the rest of the group thinking? And so I think you have to start there. What was uncovered in this investigation in terms of where does that locker room sit moving forward? And this is going to sound super cliche, but this is one of those, you almost wonder if it gets through on the other side, does it make this group stronger? And maybe either way. If Vic Koenning is not back, it shows the locker room in this team that Neal Brown to listen to them. That's something. If Vic Koenning comes and says to the team, as he's already done, and it's I understand why you're upset with the things I said. Can that be a positive moving forward? So there's still too many unanswered questions to know how it's going to affect that locker room. But I'll say this, from an X and O perspective, Vic is highly thought of and was critical to what little success West Virginia had last year, had a lot to do with Vic Koenning moving forward. So from an on-field perspective, if he's not back in that position, that will certainly change the expectations around the defense, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I told Dave, and I actually talked about this on my show where I went into this topic, that Neal Brown is the leader of this football program. He needs to administer himself as a leader of this football program, and you cannot let the inmates run the asylum. However, this is a situation based on everything going on in the world and based on the importance of this season where he really does need to listen to his players, almost take a cue from them, as you mentioned. If it's a situation where the players – regardless of the X's and O's and Vic Koenning coming off a season where he did coach him up, even though the defense struggled overall, that enough of the players believe that there is a coach of theirs that is a racist, or they believe they just don't feel comfortable playing for this man, then as much as that's going to be hard for Neal Brown, who can almost also argue that he wouldn't have the job without Vic Koenning. I mean, they have a personal connection. There are a lot of personal connections with Vic Koenning, that he was maybe the one coach you would hope this wasn't going to come out about, how much he's involved in the program. But if the players can't play for the guy, and if enough of them have a problem with this, he's probably going to be forced to cut bait, because it could then be a situation where you remove one guy and you fix it all. If that's a situation, maybe you have to go that route, but maybe they can all galvanize together and maybe they'll take his apology in. I'm always concerned with, you mentioned how Martin said he didn't want the coach to be fired, but when you throw something out there, regardless of apologies, you're going to have teammates of his now or players are going to, even recruits that are going to say, well, okay, he apologized, but I don't believe that apology. I don't believe that apology. Now I don't want to go there. Is that going to affect recruiting in the future? There's so many legs to that scandal, and it's obviously a horrible thing in general, and it has to come even before the football team on the field. But you do wonder if there's going to be a time where maybe you have to cut bait with the coach just on an indefinite leave of suspension. That's a incredible gray area. It's like somebody's out indefinitely with an injury. Nobody ever knows that time frame. So you talked about the chemistry, but do you think there could be a time? Is it in the realm of possibility that Neal Brown would have to cut bait with this man? Is that a decision that you think would be also left up to Neal Brown? Is that a situation? We still don't know the results. Again, I do agree that it's odd that hasn't come out yet, and probably will have come out by the time I release this, I would hope. But still, even if it's in retrospect, I do want fans to hear this. How much say-so do you believe Neal Brown will have on whether Vic Koenig keeps his job or not? And how has Neal Brown handled this to this point? Because it's obviously interfering with recruiting, and it's just something that he didn't want to be handling, but he's forced to.
Yeah, good question. So I think let's start with this. I go back to what I said in the very beginning about Neal Brown. Relationships are at the forefront of what his culture is about. And I think that's the crux of what this decision is about. The relationship, and this is why it's not just one end of the spectrum or the other. There's a lot of in between here that has to be ferreted out. And
right.
We mentioned some of that with how many players are we talking about, and what's their relationship with Vic Koenig? How do they feel about him in the total, not just in some of the comments that came out, but overall? I go back to what Kerry Martin said. He mentioned how he felt that Vic cared about him as a person. Vic Koenig was down in Charleston delivering food to Kerry Martin on multiple occasions in the offseason, calling his high school coach and checking up on him. So I don't get the sense that this is an all, hey, we think he's a bad guy, we've got to get rid of him. It doesn't feel like that to me. And I think that's part of why when you're trying to look outside in, it's difficult to make a prediction. You've got to get in there and find out what was said.
You don't think the players will force Neal Brown's hand and basically tell him, you got to get rid of this guy?
No, I don't know that. That's what I'm saying. I think you need to know. I think that's where the crux of this decision comes from, is what do the players think, and what does that locker room think overall? Neal Brown's relationship is not only with Vic Koenig, who he respects, brought with him from Troy. That would be an incredibly difficult decision to have to let him go. At the same time, what he cannot afford here in year two is to lose his locker room or have his guys go, Coach Brown isn't listening to us. He's not listening to what's going on in this program. So I think that's why it comes down to a very difficult decision for Neal Brown in this case. And there's so much behind the scenes that you're going to have to see and ferret out. As far as whose decision it is, I get the sense, Mike, that this will be a Neal Brown and Shane Lyons driven decision. This won't be driven from the university side of things. And sometimes this is. I get the sense that this is Neal Brown in lockstep with Shane Lyons. They, by all accounts, have a great relationship. They work well together. I mentioned earlier, Shane's the one that hired Neal. They're going to sit hand in hand and make this decision. So I have a feeling whether it's more Neal or more Shane, I think those guys are making this in lockstep with a couple other members, senior members of the athletic department. That's where it comes down to, not necessarily from the university side of things.
Yeah, and there is always the sense that maybe Neal Brown has to take the pulse of the locker room, per se, metaphorically speaking, maybe even literally speaking in terms of the opinions of the locker room, bring it to St. Lyons, they get together, and I think it is great that they have that personal relationship in terms of the future of the program. And it really could also be for Neal Brown that maybe he'll have to make the tough decision, which is kind of why I brought this up too, that maybe you might need to think about cutting bait with Vic Koenig, and that being best regardless of if that's being forced or not by the players, because that could then really win the locker room. That could bring everyone together, and maybe the locker room would feel, well, he made this personal decision that was hard for him. That's how much he really does care about us. We'll play up to our potential for him and beyond that. And this really could be a seminal moment of Neal Brown's entire Mountaineer legacy. If he would have to cut bait with his friend who he brought with him for this job in only year two when he's trying to finally turn this around, and then they could build into something and have that Cinderella story, almost a Disney movie they could make out of this, that would be a big thing in Neal Brown, and it'd be unfortunate to their relationship, but I also think Vic Koenig would understand if Neal Brown had to make that decision. I don't think he would hold a grudge because this is number one about the football team. But maybe they'll be able to move beyond this too. And also where we are in the world, we're in a world right now where it's serving everyone to listen to others and take in what people are saying, especially people maybe who are different than you, and actually have a listening conversation and trying to improve as a people. Maybe this could be a time where the players could listen to Vic Koenig. Vic Koenig could listen to the players, and maybe they actually could come to a better understanding and be all better as people from this. Maybe there is a positive from some dark days for the Mountaineers and from a scandal that did kind of stain an offseason that did build things in terms of recruiting and is very important to this football program moving forward. Brad, I appreciate the time. I definitely appreciate the time for sure. This is an important season no matter how you slice it. And I want to get you out of here with this. And this is really, if you give me a certain answer, almost none of this matters. But
I'm afraid I'm going to have to go in that direction.
Yeah, I figured too. But this is really a question about, why we're doing shows about past great Mountaineers and why scandals like this have been magnified in coverage. This is why we're all in quarantine and you're seeing home studios. The way the world is today in terms of the pandemic and how that's spiking in West Virginia, spiking in Pittsburgh, spiking in different counties. My girlfriend just told me we're 2 more weeks, no restaurants. I mean, we're going seemingly back to yellow, not sticking in green. And you hear about different programs, different teams across all of sports with positive tests and their plans. But when you get down to college athletics, and we'll leave this debate for another day, but they're not getting paid. They're not professionals. Where do you think we're going to be? Are we going to have a season? What is going to have to happen for a season to occur? And what do you think will have to happen for a season to not occur? Because it appears we're headed that way when you hear all those positive tests in Clemson. Even West Virginia has had some positive tests they've had to endure, which oddly enough, the scandal with Vic Koenig kind of put that under the radar. But they've had some positive tests. Will we have college football? And is there any credence to having college football in the spring?
Yeah, so I certainly hope we do, as I know you do, and most of the people listening to your show, if not all of them. I certainly hope we do. But here's the thing. Here's what I'll go back to. One, I think it's difficult, nearly impossible to make predictions at this point. So I don't know that I'm comfortable making a straight prediction, but I'll say this.
Yeah.
As more information becomes available and as we get closer to practice beginning to start, we're only a week or so away from the mandatory practice sessions beginning. Yeah. It's hard to find any evidence or any good news that says we're going to have a season. Instead, it's the total opposite. You're seeing challenges with positive tests. You're seeing people talking or schools talking about how expensive tests are. So they're not able to test as often as maybe they should. I think that's going to be a big issue. And then I think you mentioned it. Take the areas. Just take life for a second. And you're seeing it here in Morgantown and you're seeing West Virginia, as you alluded to. It's spiking back up. As of earlier this week, it had the 7th fastest spread rate of anywhere in the country. And remember, you haven't brought 20,000 students back into this community.
Yeah, and they're from all over the place. That's the thing.
Mike, and I think that's what colleges are going to fight all over is that's the one thing they're telling you not to do. Don't bring people in. Watch the travel. And now you're going to take an age group that doesn't want a social distance necessarily, that wants the college experience. I just think there's a ton of hurdles here. First and foremost, maybe not even the playing, just what's happening with schools. You see Harvard go all online. You see Southern Cal go to all online classes. You saw the Ivy League just today as we record this say they're canceling their fall sports. And I know people will say, well, it's the Ivy League. That's a long way from the Power Five. And it is. But let's not forget, the Ivy League was the first to cancel their basketball tournament when all the dominoes started falling. So I think the fear for sports fans and college football fans in general are there's just not a lot to hang your hat on right now that tells you things are going in the direction you want to see them in order to get football going. If you're having clusters of positive tests now and you haven't started contact and you haven't started hitting each other and droplets flying, it makes it really hard to see how you're going to be able to have an uninterrupted 3-month, 12-game football season happening in the fall. That I hope I'm dead wrong. That's hard for me to see as we sit here today in mid-July.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Again, we'll be unanimous, be pessimistic here. Again, everyone hopes it's going to happen, regardless of how seasons turn out. You'd rather have games and rather play than not. But
Right.
again, it doesn't seem possible, and especially doesn't. I don't even have really much optimism that we're going to see professional sports, even though they have
Yeah.
plans. But when you go to college, you have to have even more safety measures and even more security because it affects so many. And
Yes.
you're not even really just talking about the athletes. If the athlete has a girlfriend who's on campus who's not obviously on the team, that could be infecting her, then infecting all the friends. I mean, they just have so many. You're intermingling with the whole student body of 30 plus thousand people, not just the people on the team. You can't bubble college football teams like
Right.
maybe you can bubble an NBA team for the NBA playoffs for a few weeks in Orlando. So that's going to be another thing. Any credence though, and I don't think this makes any sense, but this has been a conversation. Any credence to having spring college football? I mean, I don't know
Yeah.
how you do that with the NFL draft. The NFL
So
is not moving that draft. They are not
so
going to do it.
so here's the crux of that decision, which is really tough. If there's no fall football for colleges, you start to really worry about the financial viability of these athletic departments. Shane Lyons here at WVU has said the football-driven revenues are somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 million of the $85 million budget. So if there's no football until 2021, you look at that athletic department and think, oh my gosh, how do they survive financially? And that's not just WVU. Play that out around the country. So
That's true.
financially, it becomes really difficult. To your point, if you say, all right, we're moving this thing to February, number one, right now, there's no guarantee that it's going to be better in February, but let's just assume it is for a second. I think the NFL thing becomes a huge issue here, number one. So you have to accept that some players are going to sit out
Yeah.
and not play in the college football season. Fans lose their mind right now when they do that in bowl games. Get ready. If you play a spring, quote, spring football season, there's a lot of guys sitting out, number one. Number
Yeah.
two, what do you do about the 2021 football season? You can't ask guys to play, in essence, 24 college games in a 7th-month season. So you're going to have to push 2021 back or do something with that season in order to get those games in. I think you've got some real health concerns. But you're going to balance that with telling these presidents and these athletic directors that you're in essence going to lose 60, 75% of your budget. So I think it's really going to get difficult if they can't play in the fall. But there's a lot of problems with spring. But Mike, right now, as the world sits, there's a lot of problems whenever football gets slated to play,
There,
unfortunately.
yeah,
I hate to end on such a downer there.
I
I
know.
hate to be such a negative Nelly to end this thing.
I know.
Jeez.
There's really no way to do anything to be 100% effective with all of this, especially before a vaccine. We don't know how the world's going to be in the future. We didn't know how things were going to even be a few weeks ago, and many thought we would be better than where we are today, than where we actually are today. So it made
Let me let me give you one last point on this. I think
Sure.
it's something you can point to that just happened down here at West Virginia. There was so much excitement in this state, and certainly from me, about the TBT basketball tournament that is ongoing right now. So West Virginia had a team of guys in it for the second straight year. Originally, Charleston, West Virginia was going to be one of the regional spots. That place would have been raucous with West Virginia fans watching these guys from different eras come together and play. Super exciting time, right? They get back together and only get 2 practices in before at least, this is just what we know of, at least 7 of the guys out of the 11 or 12, 7 of the guys tested positive after just a couple of practices. One of them had it, close contact, 7 of them get it. Then, right on the heels of that, so West Virginia has to pull out of that tournament. We've seen 4 or 5 teams overall have to exit from that tournament before even getting a game in because of the positive test. So now carry that forward. So that's 70%, 60% of that particular group test positive after just a couple practices. West Virginia's basketball team, WVU's basketball team and program, just had to delay the start of its workouts, which were slated to begin on Monday the 13th. They had to back that up for 2 weeks because 5 of their players and 1 staff member also tested positive. So just combine those 2 rosters. I mean, 13 or 14 WVU players, 11 or 12 TBT guys, 12 player positives out of that 24 or 25 guys. I think that tells you what you're dealing with, because then if you contact trace those and you end up with another 12 or 13 that have to sit, what do football teams do? Right? What do football teams do if that week you have 8 starters and 12 other guys that have to sit and can't make the trip.
Yeah, and I don't
That's
see
tough.
I don't see also how you do practice, how you do a training camp of sorts, how you tackle anyone with what's going on here. There's been football players that have already tested positive, and they tested positive when there was nothing going on.
No contact yet.
So imagine, I mean, we don't know what's going on in their personal life, but they tested positive when there was nothing mandated for them to do physically. And then when you have that be the case, you can't imagine what's going to happen. And even if you have all the student body go online and just have the football team bubbled, that's still a lot of players. How are you going to control every one of them to not intermingle? You can't really bubble a 19-year-old like you could a professional athlete getting paid.
And I'm not sure. And I'll be honest with you, Mike. I'm not sure PR wise you can bring student athletes onto campus and put them in that situation if you deem the campus not safe for the rest of the students.
I think it almost has to dictate each other. And really, again, I think you're probably not going to have, maybe everything we talked about on this show is moot. I don't think you're probably going to have college football, maybe even less likely than the other sports because of everything we mentioned here. Or you're going to give it a shot and then be closing up shop here soon. There's been the conversation of just conference games because of geographic purposes. But the funny thing is, with all conference realignment for the Mountaineers, that's not geographically sound. That's tons of travel into a lot of places that aren't places you want to be right now based on the virus. I don't know. Maybe you get 12 weeks of the backyard brawl again. we can do that. I don't know.
I'll take a couple of those.
Yeah, that would be
now.
That would be fun. Yeah, that's about, I think, the best we can do right now. But maybe even an unsanctioned game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but I mean, so I'm pessimistic about it as well. But maybe that'll even be more time for Neal Brown to recruit. I don't know how that will affect recruiting next year. Again, I don't think anything in terms of playing college football in the spring is even remotely a conversation unless you've called the NFL and they agree to move their draft to June. If they're not moving the draft, you can't do it because you're going to see any college football player that most casual fans know will not play, and I wouldn't even advise them to play. There'd be almost no positive possibly gained. Brad Howe, former assistant athletic director with West Virginia University and co-host of the statewide Sportsline on WVMetroNews.com and, of course, 32 stations all across West Virginia. Brad, I definitely appreciate the time, and we'll have to do this again, regardless of whether there's games. We'll find something to talk about.
Anytime, Mike. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Again, Brad Howe, co-host of the statewide Sportsline there with Tony Caridi and company, and of course the former assistant athletic director at West Virginia University. Want to tell everyone to make sure you hit us up on the family of Now Network sites, PittsburghSportsNow.com. That's the flagship site there. Does have Pitt coverage. Some Mountaineer fans watching this maybe don't go there, but WV Sports Now, we also have Pittsburgh Hockey Now, Pittsburgh Soccer Now, Pittsburgh Golf Now as well. So we got everything going on in the Now Network. And find us on Twitter at PGH Sports Live. And down below this video, click the subscribe button. Make it easier for us to keep churning this content for you. So thanks again to Brad Howe there with WVMetroNews.com and the statewide Sportsline. That is a gem of a program, and I hope to get back on there again sometime soon.